Good morning, everyone. Just waiting for everyone to join the call. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU. I'm really pleased. I'm going to pause 1 second because some more people are just entering. There we go. Really pleased to welcome you all here this morning for another one of our LGIU Ask the Expert sessions. Like all the events in this series, this is exclusively for you as LGIU members. For those of you who perhaps only experience LGIU through our invaluable daily emails and briefings, we are the UK's largest independent local government membership body. We were set up by three councils more than 40 years ago, and today your council is one of more than 300 members of LGIU across the UK, Ireland, and Australia. Our job is to support local government, support you in the work you do for your communities, for your places. And we have a team of experts who are on hand to keep you informed, to keep you engaged, connected, to do the analysis, to make sure you're listened to. So we provide guidance on legislation, on key developments, insight, shared learning, training, member-driven research, and opportunities like this one to come together with colleagues and dig into some of the challenges that we're grappling with. Now, today, we're focusing on a topic that is pretty much, well, I was going to say top of everyone's minds. It's certainly very, very near the top of almost everyone's minds. So devolution and local government reorganisation. And one of the things we might come to is how much work that and does, because they are separate things happening at the same time. Um, we know it's been a bit of a roller coaster since the devolution white paper was published just before Christmas, and councils across the country are now facing really critical decisions that are going to potentially really shape the future of local government for decades to come. So today we want to get into that evolving landscape a bit. We'll be breaking down some of the latest legislative frameworks, some of the key policy shifts, and some of the practical steps for local authorities who are trying to navigate this. And of course, we'll be asking you for your questions and your insights. Um, We'll be giving you a little update on some of the insights from our latest research that we published last week. There was a sort of an analysis of where we are after the interim proposals that came in on the 21st of March. But I'm delighted to say that to talk us through all of this and more, we're welcoming Laura Hughes. Now, Laura is a partner at Brown Jacobson, who many of you will know as people who have provided really important legal insight on some of these questions around devolution, reorganisation for many years. And we're really pleased today to be formally welcoming Brown Jacobson as a founding member of LGIU's new Strategic Partners Programme. We've been working with Brown Jacobson for many, many years, going back at least, I think, to 2010. So we've done a lot of work with them over the years, and we're really pleased to be building on that work to have a more sort of formal strategic partnership. Before we kick off, a couple of housekeeping things, and I apologize for talking fast because we keep these sessions at a tight hour and there's a lot to get through. We are going to be recording the presentations from today's session, but we're going to turn off the recording for the Q&A and the conversation afterwards. So I hope people will feel free to speak their minds, and we'll be observing Chatham House rules, obviously, for that. We'll be having Laura and I are both going to run through some initial observations, and then we'll have Q&A. Please feel free to add questions to the chat at any time, and our team will collate those and point them in my or Laura's direction. But before I properly introduce Laura and hand over to her, I wanted to just briefly run through some of the results of our latest analysis at LGIU on the state of play in reorganisation. We're not talking about Devo for the moment, along with some reflections. So I'm going to try and share my screen. There we go. So we did, and I say we very deliberately. The team here did. It was really interesting. So a really in-depth analysis where they sort of got all the interim proposals that came in on the 21st of March, coded up the data in them, and sort of did some analysis to see what sort of patterns, if any, are emerging in those proposals. And why is the going forward not working? There we go. So we looked at the number of proposals, i.e. the number of unique documents submitted, the number of new unitary councils that were being proposed, or the range of number of new unitary councils being proposed within that those documents. We looked at some of the population sizes that were being proposed. Obviously, that's been a key point of debate in this. We looked at some of the estimated costs of developing business cases, some of the estimated transition costs, some of the type of financial analysis being employed and by whom, what people were asking for from central government to make this process work, and next steps. Where do we go from here? Now, all of that is on our website, so I would encourage you to go and have a look. But just some key headlines from that. When we look at, the proposed sizes of new unitary councils, obviously the white paper set out an aspiration of around 500,000 population. There is nowhere in the areas that have come forward for the 21st of March where there is a single agreed proposal around the number and size of new unitaries at this point. Everyone is talking about a range of possibilities to be investigated and the business cases to be developed in the next stage of this. And as you can see, I think it's just interesting to note that that range is really, really broad. So you can see the dotted line there is the sort of 500,000 the government originally said it wanted, though they've rode back on that a little since. And we can see that quite a lot of places are mooting the possibility of unitaries that are significantly smaller than that, some under 200,000, and some places are mooting the possibility of unitaries that are significantly bigger than that. In some cases, well, in one case, over 1.5 million people, but in a couple of cases, over 1 million people. So we don't know yet where we're going to land in those ranges, but I think it's worth noting that this is still very much up for debate. There are still, the proposals that are coming forward cover a huge range of different population sizes. And so that's sort of government aspiration. And the last time I heard Jim McMahon talk about this, he talked about, well, it's going to be a sort of average around the whole country. That's looking like it might be quite hard to achieve. We looked a little bit at the costs of developing the business case. So these are just the project costs. And again, as you can see, a range of costs. Call me cynical, but I suspect that the sort of right-hand side of the graph is likely to be more accurate than the left-hand side of the graph, but we'll see. But, significant in some areas where there's complex issues to be sort of modeled out. We're talking about fairly significant costs, which are basically falling in this year over the course of developing these cases. And we also looked at where people had in their proposals estimated the transition costs. And again, we're seeing some quite substantial costs, averaging out just over 30 million, but in some cases, significantly north of that. And in all cases, quite significant. Now, we know that there's a lot of modelling around the savings that reorganisation can achieve. And so, these transition costs are relatively short term and maybe overweighed by savings in the long term, but there are, when you take into account both the project costs and the transition costs, there are significant costs attached to this process, if not to the outcomes. We also asked people what they needed from government to make this work in terms of taking it forward to the next stage. And actually, we got quite a lot of pretty consistent answers here. There were some clear things when we did the kind of textual analysis of what people had been saying. There are some clear things that are coming out that people want from government. So we saw that people wanted, because the government is part of those proposals, said please identify, the barriers or challenges where further clarity or support would be helpful, which people did. And the things that they came up with above all were sustainable funding to support both the short and long-term financial issues. Now, I think it's quite interesting that in some ways, councils in these proposals are sort of leveraging this process to say, actually, what we need from government, irrespective of reorganisation, is a sustainable funding system. People were saying we need more clarity about the population criteria. The white paper specified a population figure of at least 500,000. Since then, there's been a lot of kind of movement on that. And as you saw from my earlier slide, people are saying, look, we are looking at everything from 150,000 up to 1.6 million. What are the government's red lines on that? People talked about a more structured and transparent relationship with central government. So, we're just starting in the DPP areas to see some named points of contact at MHCLG, but I think there has generally been a sense that people have not had as clear a relationship with government in this process as they would like. They've asked for guidance on asset and debt and asset management. Obviously, one of the issues in some places is that you have some of the councils that are potentially being wound down and then those areas moved into new unitaries. What happens to debt? What happens to assets? That is a massive issue in some places, and it's not really clear. They need transparency, clarity on boundaries and geography. There are a few places where some of the options involve cutting existing councils in half. It's not clear how that would work, what the Boundary Commission would need to do, how that will impact. Laura may be able to offer us some insight into that, but councils are confused about that. And again, I think it's one of the things where government could be quite directive about that and say we are going to enable that process, or what, guys, forget it. You have to work within existing boundaries. But that clarity has not been forthcoming. And then finally, the other key issue that came up was around civic protections. So there are, one of the things I think that has been discussed relatively little in all this is sort of identity, place identity, but in at least 4 regions, there's been real clarity around long-standing civic ceremonial arrangement, Lord Lieutenants, High Sheriffs. What happens to these people if the entity that they are kind of attached to ceases to exist? Do they go? Do they stay? How does that? So there's a bit of confusion around that. So I'm going to stop there and introduce Laura, who hopefully can give us some insight into some of the things that people are confused about. But I think at the very least can sort of show us where the confusion is. I think it's always useful to know what are the things you don't know because you just don't know them, and what are the things you don't know because there aren't yet answers to them. And I think I always find Laura's very good at sort of showing me which thing is which. Laura heads up the public law team at Brown Jacobson. She's also the head of the Insurance and Public Risk Department. She's the exec lead for Wales. She's an experienced public law expert who advises clients across the country on a whole range of really high-profile issues around, she works in government, local government, education, health, audit, sports, natural resources. She was named in the Lawyers Hot 100 for 2025 and was named Law Firm Lead of the Year at a national regional firm in the Women and Diversity in Law Awards in 2025. So she is on a roll. And we've worked with Laura for many years, and I always find her insights really, really helpful. So I'm going to hand over to you, Laura.
Thank you. That's the first thing I've spoken at where those new things have been added at the end. It's quite excruciating, but thank you for that intro. I'm going to share some slides, and as Jonathan said, there's a few bits in them that I'm sure people will be quite well aware of, pulling out some of the stuff in the white paper, so I won't dwell on those, but I will just try and bring to life. It's interesting. Jonathan and I were talking just before you all came into the session, and what's in the LGIU report on this is very much what I'm hearing on the ground about what's kind of missing at the moment in terms of what councils need. And I don't have the answers to all of those, as Jonathan alluded to. It's not always there aren't answers to all of those things, but there are a few things that I can probably and add some illumination on. So hopefully you can see my slides. Yep.
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, so as Jonathan said, I mean, the LGIU report focuses on local government reorganisation. I am going to touch on devolution as well, but I'll start with LGR. And I'm just going to briefly set out the policy position and the legal position in terms of some of the process to make the changes that the government are wanting to see. And then I'm going to just talk about some of those points actually that Jonathan had flagged, which I've sort of called hot topics because they were stuff that was coming up in what we've been discussing with contacts clients, potential clients, as well as they've been going through this process. I suppose before I get into LGR, one thing that I've been finding it's quite useful to say at the start of these is that we are here dealing with a multitude of different arrangements in different areas that this kind of combined approach on LGR and Devo is trying to address in England. And that means that different councils are all in very different places. So we've got, outside of London, we've got 4 broad sort of scenarios here. We've got areas which are already unitary councils and already have a combined authority over the top of them, or strategic authority as we now are calling them. Obviously, they don't need to make any further changes, but some of the policy announcements that were in the white paper about changes that will be made to standard powers and approaches to combined authorities or strategic authorities going forwards will apply to them. But they're probably the ones with the least to do, I suppose, as it were, in terms of some of this change, but there is still going to be change. You've then got some areas where there are unitary councils, but not yet a strategic authority. Obviously, they will need to go through a process of working with other unitaries to create strategic authorities, whether that's in the case where it's already unitaries, that would be a combined authority legally. You've got some areas, which is the majority of the areas in the priority programme, but there's a few others like this as well, which where there are county councils, so 2-tier council underneath, but they also don't have a combined authority. So they need to both reorganise and create a new strategic authority. Now, the timing of how that's going to work is that you're going to have, for certainly those in the priority programme other than Surrey, which is a slightly different situation, you're going to have the creation of a combined county authority because they generally include some county areas, although not all. And that once there's unitisation that happens underneath. I'm not even sure unitisation is a word, but when unitary authorities are created underneath, then that combined county authority will have to become a strategic authority, but that will probably just be bundled up in the various different pieces of legislation that will need to be created for that. So those are areas that have got both things to do. And then the final group is areas which have already got combined county authorities over the top, but have 2-tier government underneath, where you need to create unitary councils underneath those. So that's, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, Lancashire, and a number of other areas that have got combined county authorities in place at the moment. And again, once the unitary authorities are created underneath, at some point those combined county authorities will need to change to combined authorities. So there's 4 sort of distinct groups outside of London, and then obviously in London you've got the GLA, where the policy paper talks about bringing it more in line with combined authorities in terms of powers and things like that. But I've not seen any evidence of that. It'd be interesting to hear from any London boroughs about whether that's actually anything seems to be happening there, because it doesn't seem to be happening to me. But certainly outside of London, there's 4 key sort of groups there, which is obviously why you've got different councils with different sets of considerations and looking at different things. It also makes the timetabling of all this incredibly complex, which we'll come back to. So having done that, I'm just going to cover really quickly LGR. So I won't dwell on the policy position because Jonathan's talked about it to an extent, but it's, this is broadly the policy position, is that the government wants all remaining 2-tier areas plus smaller or failing unitaries, which I think is something that it is worth just flagging, because for example, in Nottinghamshire, the letter went to Nottinghamshire and Nottingham City, which is a council which is obviously subject to measures at the moment. And I think you can work out which the government think are the smaller or failing unitaries, because they've had letters indicating that they're sort of expected to be part of this reorganisation. So there's a few like that which are already unitaries, but where they're sort of being given the clear indication by government that they need to be part of this. So as Jonathan said, the white paper talked about 500,000 plus, but even the white paper said there could be exceptions, and certainly, as Jonathan says, they seem to be rowing back from that slightly. Having said that, the narrative is very much about smaller councils not being as viable, and I think probably there is some evidence of that in some places. So it'll be interesting to see where they land on just how small is okay and what is the justification for that. And I think there will have to be a justification. That's my sort of guess on that, is that it won't be enough to say we just, it works better for us. There'll have to be some kind of clear economic or social justification to indicate why a smaller grouping might work. As it says there, they asked for proposals from various areas. In the priority areas, there's 6 of them, and 4 of them include local government reorganisation, and then you've got Surrey on top of that who are doing local government reorganisation first. So the counties involved are set out there. Surrey's on a quicker timetable, so they've got until the 9th of May to make their formal proposals. Everybody else in the priority group are being asked for them by the 26th of September. Elections proposed in all of those areas elections for May 2025 have been postponed, that should say, rather than proposed in all of those areas, and shadow authority elections then in May 26, vesting, so coming into existence, the new unitaries in April 27, so you'll have a shadow period for a year. And then all of the 2-tier areas were written to and asked for formal proposals by the 28th of November, presumably with a view to shadow authorities in May 27 and vesting in April 28, and that's sort of what I've heard people talk about. But I'm a bit dubious about whether all of that can happen at once. And as we know, interim plans were submitted on the 21st of May, and we're waiting to hear from government. And we may discuss that a bit further as to what's likely to happen next in a bit. That's not even clear as to what government intend to do next with all of this information they've got, or how quickly they intend to review it. So the legislation involved here is the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act 2007. So under Section 2, the Secretary of State can invite proposals from principal authorities. That's what's happened. And there's 3 clear types of proposals that can be made. So a single tier for the whole county area, a single tier for local government for 1 or more districts within the county, or a single tier for one of the above plus a relevant adjoining area, which is in effect a district or a county adjoining. So what's interesting on that in the question of boundaries is that can actually only, at the moment, councils can only make proposals that include full current local government entities merging together in effect, or splitting apart if it's a county. What they can't do is propose to, formally anyway, propose to split a sort of district council, for example. Now, that doesn't mean to say that that can't be done. Because the Secretary of State can implement a proposal with modifications. So the Secretary of State does have the power to do something different with boundaries. So whilst the councils cannot make a proposal formally, at least, which talks about splitting, the Secretary of State has got the power to decide that that's an appropriate thing to do. And what I've been saying to clients is probably, again, we need some clarity from government on what they want here, but certainly it's open to say, look, here's our formal proposal, which lawfully can only include full areas being merged or split, but we think actually it would be useful, whilst we can't formally propose this, we think it would be the right thing to do to split a boundary here, and then it's on the table for the Secretary of State for something that they can do in response to a formal proposal. Currently, and again, we were talking about this just before, there is no power of direction, so you can't be forced to make a proposal at the moment. You can be asked, and I know the letters that came out from government very much read like a direction, but they aren't, in fact, because there is no power currently for that. But they have talked about the English Devolution Bill reintroducing that power of direction, so that you can be sort of forced to make a proposal. In effect, you can be directed by the government to make a proposal. But as I say, crucially, that's not there right now. So at the moment, and I know it feels different to that, and I also know that I wouldn't want to be the one council probably that wasn't sort of in the camp with everybody else, but it cannot be forced currently. A consultation is only required with any local authority affected who did not make the proposal under consideration, and such other persons as the Secretary of State thinks appropriate. So there's no sort of there's no duty to consult more widely with local people, for example. Having said that, again, the government's letters out do indicate a view that the government thinks that engagement should be undertaken with local people now. I think that's deliberate wording, engagement rather than consultation. Any lawyers listening will know that there's a difference between the two, and consultation draws in various obligations, whereas engagement can be looser, but it's not just in the name, it's it's around how you do it as well. So, and I know some areas have done more, and obviously you can do more, you can do formal consultation, you can do that if you wish to, but it's not something that's absolutely required by legislation. And it'll be interesting again to see what the government expects in relation to engagement with local people. And in some cases, there's not really very much time for that. So, as I said already, the Secretary of State can implement a proposal with or without modifications, and the Secretary of State may seek advice from the Boundary Commission, but isn't required to. And this is different to a process where the Boundary Commission would review boundaries and come up with their own proposals. That's a separate section of this legislation. So the Boundary Commission position here is very vague again, and I think again, and one of those areas of clarity that we don't have at the moment is how much is the government going to be speaking to the Boundary Commission about this? They're not required to, but again, I think it would be surprising if they didn't take views from them at least. But there is a question of capacity at the Boundary Commission as well. So there's some interesting questions there. Jumping on to English devolution before I come back to consider some of those points in a bit more detail. So again, the policy position, which will be very well known, universal coverage of strategic authorities is the aim, and the size there is more than 1.5 million people. There's some interesting things I've been hearing about areas where there are large unitaries at the moment, where the government is sort of talking about, look, if you want to have a combined authority over just that geography, you need to split into 2 unitaries to sit underneath, because of their policy position that they don't want single council combined authorities as they've had in the past. Well, they're not combined authorities technically, but single council devolution is what they've had. So Cornwall and other areas have had some devolved powers to them as unitary councils. That's not the desire anymore. They want to have a strategic body that sits over the top of unitaries underneath. And so it seems that in some areas there's discussions about, splitting up large unitaries to create then the ability to have a combined authority over the top. I don't know whether I think that's a bit bizarre, but I think in some areas the geography is going to push to that if the government's going to hold true to this policy position. So that's another interesting point. They talk about these needing to have functional economic areas, have contiguous boundaries with other strategic authorities, so no devolution islands, have an identity, and be aligned with other public sector boundaries where possible. How you achieve all of that, I don't quite know, given that a lot of this geography is already set. And also at the moment, we are still approaching this from a bottom-up perspective with areas proposing what they want. Now, that is inevitably going to lead to some areas where there's some sort of gaps, or that'll need to be, as I say, in this solution around splitting a larger unitary into 2 to have a strategic authority over the top, which I think is about filling a gap broadly. It may be where we end up with some of this, because if the government isn't going to direct where it thinks the new strategic authorities need to be, then there is the prospect of proposals coming forward that don't sort of fill all the gaps. Again, I think what I'm hearing is that they're doing that kind of behind the scenes at the moment without formal direction. Right now, they don't have the power to direct, they don't have the power to direct, which I'll come back to, but they are going to give themselves that. So we're going to have, again, you've got priority devolution programme with 6 areas there. They're going to be having mayoral elections in May 26. The policy position also outlines that they're going to now have foundation, mayoral and established. Foundation are not really wanted. They're those single county sort of devolved areas, or which then just don't want anymore. So they're sort of a temporary stopgap. You've then got mayoral, which is the standard sort of strategic authority, and established. And established strategic authorities will have additional powers and privileges, I suppose. And so there's some criteria set out in the white paper for becoming established, which is that you have to have been in existence for 18 months, have published a local assurance framework, not be subject to a best value notice, have no material accounting concerns, and then a track record of managing major programmes. And that, to me, is the government's kind of get out of jail free card, because what does that mean? Who decides that? The rest of it's pretty clear cut. It's either yes or no, but the track record of managing major programmes gives them a discretion here to decide whether you're in or out. And those established areas will be in receipt of integrated settlements, which will allow much more freedom about how money is spent within strategic authorities. So that will be subject to a single mutually agreed outcomes framework and monitored over a spending period. So it's obviously still going to have to be monitored and controlled to an extent, but it's going to be a lot more freedom around that. As I said earlier, there's going to be an English devolution bill. They're going to introduce a direction power to enable them to direct sort of things around this. So geographies direct coming forward, the proposals around this. They're going to introduce a standard set of powers and governance framework. So for that first group I talked about earlier, which is, where you've already got both unitaries and a strategic authority, this is the big change really, is that kind of standard list of powers and the governance framework, which is going to apply to everybody uniformly, apart from with some differences between established and mayoral, but they're going to be very clear cut. I actually do think that's progress. I think one of the challenges around strategic authorities so far has been that they each have very different sets of powers, not completely different, but there's differences around the edges. It's not clear why some areas have got some things and not others. I'm sure it is to those who were there and negotiated them at the time, because I know they're all hard won, but it's not necessarily transparent to the public, and it's not always very easy to work out what governance is either. So I think that probably does help. And then a move to simple majority voting in all cases. And again, that's something that is slightly controversial in that some areas, particularly those in combined county authorities that have just come forward, have sort of negotiated vetoes and things like that into some of this, which are all immediately going to come out. So that has been slightly controversial too. So the legislation here is the Local Democracy, Economy and Construction Act 2009 for combined authorities and the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2024 for combined county authorities. And the difference is combined county authorities are needed where you've got two-tier government. So in those priority areas where you have got a number that are still two-tier, they're going to have to be CCAs to start with, but will become CAs over time when it's unitaries underneath. Legally, at the moment, there is no sort of strategic authority. That's a policy term. You are either a combined authority or a combined county authority. And it's going to be interesting to see whether they actually change the terminology to strategic authority throughout the legislation. I'd be quite surprised if they did. The indications so far seem to be that these two models will carry on for at least a period of time, but at some point CCAs are going to become obsolete because they're not going to be needed, because there's going to be unitaries everywhere. But we'll see what happens on that. Two possible processes for creation of combined county authorities. I won't concentrate, and it's the same for combined authorities in truth, but I won't concentrate on the first because the one that we're seeing come through the priority programme, and the one I think they're going to have to use to hit the deadlines they're talking about in other cases as well, is that a proposal doesn't come up from the local authority. In effect, what we've seen with the priority programme areas is that the Secretary of State has, in essence, they've put out a consultation, which in essence contains a proposal that they're consulting on. The consultation is carried out by the Secretary of State rather than locally, and then the Secretary of State then make regulations which create a combined county authority, and that, or a combined authority, you can do both that way, which shortens the process, because when it's done locally, done consultation tends to be more involved. They're creating a proposal which then needs to be submitted, etc. There is still a need for consent from the councils concerned. It can't just be done to them at the moment. So that still has to happen, but effectively the process we're seeing at the moment puts the Secretary of State in the driving seat on timing and makes things go a bit quicker. The new powers and governance framework, I'd put 2027 there. There's some indication that the English devolution bill might come a bit quicker than that. I'm not completely convinced it will be in, but there's a possibility it can be through in 2026, so we'll see. Early part of the very quickest would be sort of mid 2026, I think. It depends what else they're trying to do though. And that will take a standard approach. But in the meantime, they will take a standard approach in regulations creating strategic authorities, so that you'll in effect, you'll get that standard set of powers and that standard of governance coming through in the establishment orders anyway. And so we've got the timetable for new strategic authorities in May 26, which is that priority group. We expect there to be a further wave for May 2027. I've had a mess around with a map, and I think there might be about 7 or 8 more to come. But we'll see whether I'm right about that. So hot topics. So again, Jonathan's touched on these. I'm not going to take ages because I want there to be lots of time for questions, but timing and complexity. So the government stated priority was devolution, but what we're actually seeing is with all the stuff going out on LGR, they're really trying to twin track them. So I think it's not actually the case that devolution is a priority over LGR. That doesn't seem to be what we're seeing. I think they want to do both, but there's a real question in my mind about whether they can do both across the whole country all at the same time with all these different scenarios we've got to deal with. I've talked about the multiple scenarios already. The timetable for areas in the priority programme is complex and overlapping. So if you take Surrey, for example, where they're doing LGR first, and then immediately looking to do devolution immediately afterwards, that is going to mean that you're going to have a shadow authority in existence for the new unitaries at the same time as you're out, the Secretary of State's out for consultation on creation of a strategic authority. So there's going to be a lot happening, and it'll be the same the other way around for the other priority groups who are doing strategic authorities first, but will then have to do local government reorganisation after. If you do them one after the other, there won't be the same overlap exactly, because you'll have the new strategic authority in place, but the new strategic authority will literally be in place at a point that you're also putting in place. Well, you're also starting the process of creating new unitaries underneath. So one thing I'm hearing is that government aren't being very clear on timetabling and what's going to happen when and how that's going to work. I suspect that's because they haven't really worked it all out for themselves yet, or worked out what their capacity is as to how many they can do at once, and so therefore how quickly all these things might be able to happen. So in those priority areas, are they going to immediately do local government reorganisation afterwards? I think that's an interesting question. It's not something that's been formally committed to, but I'm hearing is something the government's talking about behind the scenes. So we'll see. And then what's timetable for other areas? It's really unclear at the moment, and there is a lot of complexity around it. As I say, I have some concern about capacity of government to manage too many of these all at the same time. Size and geography, again, Jonathan's touched on this, so I won't go into too much detail, but those 500,000 and 1.5 million, like how hard and fast are they? And if not size, what are the other reasons that might be acceptable for bringing areas together or splitting them apart? How do we close gaps in the geography for combined authorities, combined county authorities in a way that works? Can areas join existing strategic authorities? They absolutely can legislatively. It's possible. There's a process for it. It can be done. But again, that doesn't seem to really be on the table. What I've been saying to people is if you really want to join an existing strategic authority, then I'd go and speak to them first and go together to government, because then if they're agreeable, because that will put it on the table, but it doesn't seem to be something that's being talked about a lot. Whereas in some cases, I think it might be a sensible thing to avoid these devolution islands, is extend some of the strategic authorities that exist and take a few more councils into them. And for LGR, this question of bringing in adjacent areas and the question of parts of areas, that's not clear at the moment either. Government haven't been giving answers on that. Consultation, I'm hearing that some of the areas in the priority programme are not happy about the consultation that's being carried on at the moment by the Secretary of State in relation to creation of new strategic authorities. And I can understand that, having worked on the kind of old route of doing it with areas making proposals and deciding for themselves what consultation to do, and most have done quite extensive consultation, really knowing their local areas and working out what's needed and what sort of hard to reach groups and how you might reach them and things like that. None of that's happening with this. It's literally on the government's website, and the documents are very standard. Actually, there's a little bit of local stuff in there, but unless you are computer literate, and and unless councils may be doing more locally as well with it, I'm sure they probably are. But the primary way to make a consultation response here is to get up on the government website, read the document, and put some submissions in. And so there's concerns that that's not reaching into the areas in question. There's some serious questions about what consultation is going to be expected, or engagement, whatever we want to call it, with the public around LGR. What's the government's expectation on that? Because it's all well and good saying, basically the legislation doesn't require it, we want you to engage. But I think the government needs to give more clarity around that, because unless they do, there is going to be a different approach in different areas, and that makes it ripe for some kind of legal challenge, I think, pointing across the boundary and saying, well, over there they've had loads of consultation and we haven't had any. So I think, there's an interesting question there where I think government ought to show some leadership, but at the moment doesn't seem to be. And as I say, the concern doesn't seem to be shared with government. They, I think, for reasons of speed, are sort of seeking to keep that to a minimum. Boundaries, we've talked about splitting. Do they have to follow local government boundaries? Aligning with other public sector boundaries, that's very much in the white paper as a policy objective, but again, absolutely no clarity from the government about how much they want to see that, or if that needs splitting of areas, what do they want you to do? So that's not, and obviously public sector boundaries aren't all aligned anyway in other spaces. So which ones are we talking about here? And the role of the Boundary Commission I've already touched on. And then finance, debt and assets. Again, Jonathan's covered this, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but we're certainly already having areas contacting us saying, look, this serious, we've got a broadly shared view about what we want to achieve with unitaries. The major stumbling block is a couple of these councils have got huge debts, and if we put them together and into the geography that would work best, the new council, if it has to take on all that debt, is going to be absolutely, is going to struggle from day one, or be unviable from day one. But if we then carve it up in a different way to make sure the debt's more evenly spread, the geographies don't work as well. And this is the kind of stuff that, and then what about assets? Could we have assets that sit in one area and basically give them to another area to help manage the debt? Like, give the capital assets so they can be sold and the debt can be offset. Can we do that? And I think local areas are trying to come up with these solutions, but at the moment, government are absolutely refusing to engage on that and just saying you need to try and solve it locally. Again, I'm not sure that's going to cut the mustard, because these are clearly massively areas that are ripe for fallouts between councils. And if that's what happens, then the whole thing could fall apart, because people aren't going to want to go into new unitaries that are not viable from day one. So there needs to be some clarification on that. Looking back at previous arrangements, as we have done at Brown Jacobson, it isn't clear. In some areas it's more detailed in the establishment legislation as what's going to happen, but most of the time they've managed to do it by agreement behind the scenes. And but that's because it wasn't mandated. So you've got people getting to a place together and sort of realizing they have to work through it, but that's not really the case here. And there's some areas who are, some parts of areas in particular that are very anti this generally, and so expecting some kind of agreement on these really complex issues, I think, is potentially unrealistic. So the next phase, it's all very easy to focus on how it's going to work to make it happen, but there's lots of then conversations and considerations beginning to happen about what it looks like into the future and what's going to make it work into the future when we have this new model. And I talked there about 3 tiers of government. It certainly is going to be strategic authorities and then local authorities, which will be unitaries. But we're also seeing lots of parish councils or areas sort of starting to talk about whether they can do governance reviews now to create more parish councils, because they're concerned about the connection between local people and government being more distant with the unitaries that are going to be bigger potentially. So that parish councils may become more meaningful. I know they are very meaningful in some areas, but that's not uniformly the case. So we'll see what happens there. And interestingly, Jonathan's right. I've had requests for advice about ceremonial titles and things like that. And again, the answer is it's not very easy, but it can be provided for in the legislation. And that would be the easiest thing for the government to say here, would just be, look, if you've got ceremonial things that you all agree you want to keep, we'll find a way to provide for that in the establishment legislation, so that they carry on. But do they need to change name and things like that? There's practical considerations there. So what makes the future work? Relationships, I think, are absolutely key. Facilitation powers of mayors. They're going to have more powers to bring public sector organisations to the table. I think that'd be useful. And delivery of services at the right level is going to require cooperation. So there's opportunities to have shared service arrangements across, if you're splitting counties up, for example, across former county areas to deliver, and it's referenced in the LGIU document, children's trusts and things like that are options around this. So beginning to think about that at this point as well, so that you're not disaggregating things that you might want to reaggregate in the future. But relationships are key. And I guess my current concern with the government not giving as much clarity around some of this is that relationships are going to be strained. And that's not a great place to start when you're setting up new process of doing government. Delivery teams are going to be key. So councils working together on transition to strategic authorities and LGR. And in some cases, I say that's going to be overlapping. It's going to be a heck of a lot of capacity in some areas of people who are not doing day jobs because they're focused on these projects. Project management is going to be key to keep everything on time and on target, because once you start these things, I think it's very difficult to stop. You have to know, this is why the timetable is so key. You have to know what you're doing in what order, because if you start to, for example, work together with the councils around procurement, so you're not duplicating on procurement going forwards, you can only do that for so long before you have a new organisation in place, before it becomes difficult legally. So I think knowing what's going to happen and when, and having project management around that is going to be really important. And then there is clearly going to be a transition phase where protection of delivery of services is going to be important when people are busy doing this other stuff and delivering in a way, as I say, which doesn't undermine new structures. So looking at procurement together, looking at disaggregation of services if you need to, looking at staffing, because people might want to leave if they know organisations are going to cease to exist. So you're really trying to work in a way that allows you to drive to those end results. But at the moment, I think there's so little clarity on some of the timetabling here and what's going to happen and when, that's really difficult, and it's just leading to a lot of uncertainty. So that's me. There's some conclusion there, but I won't go into that because that's some of the stuff we'll cover. So I'll just stop sharing, although I found that challenging earlier. So let me just, there we go.
Well, that's okay. Laura, thank you so much. That was
No problem.
really interesting. And I mean, I guess whenever I talk to you about this, I'm always struck by the fact that something that I thought was really complex is actually even more complex than I realized. And just the sort of the level of ambition of trying to do all of this all at once in so many places across such a tight timetable. And although I guess I also find myself thinking, on the one hand, and I guess this is just a political judgment. On the one hand, thinking this is mad to try and do all this so quickly all at once, and without having worked out some of the questions that you're talking about. But I'm also conscious that I've spent years criticizing governments for not just getting going on things, and that the attempt to sort of have everything worked out before you start often means you never get anywhere. So I guess we'll find out which of those those situations we're in. Look, let's open it up for questions and comments. You can do that in